The room had been built to contain things. No windows, no clocks, no warmth, just fluorescent panels humming overhead, and a single steel table bolted into the floor like it was meant to anchor more than furniture. Small cameras blinked red from the corners, steady and patient, recording every pause, every breath. Staff Sergeant Ronan Cross sat alone at the table. His hands rested flat against the metal, fingers relaxed, posture straight without stiffness. He didn't shift. He didn't fidget. His face showed nothing that could be taken and twisted. Not blank, controlled. Around him, senior officers filled the room in pressed uniforms, backs straight, arms crossed, expressions already formed. This wasn't a place designed for listening. It was designed for judgment. Brigadier General Corwin Rusk leaned back in his chair, skimming a thin personnel file as if it were light reading. He glanced up with a faint smile, the kind meant for the room rather than the man sitting alone at the table. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. Rusk tapped the folder once. Staff Sergeant Cross, he said lightly, voice carrying. Let's talk about your record. A few officers exchanged looks. Someone near the far end of the table smiled. Ronan didn't react. On paper, Rusk continued, flipping a page. You're unremarkable. He tilted his head. No negative remarks. No real highlights either, just safe language. He turned another page. Training blocks without outcomes. Deployments listed by regions instead of units. Entire sections redacted. A soft chuckle escaped him. Almost looks like someone didn't want us to understand what you were doing. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Ronan kept his gaze level, fixed just beyond Rusk's shoulder. Too much eye contact would look defiant. Too little would look weak. He had learned long ago how to give exactly the amount required and not an inch more. Western Pacific, Rusk read aloud. Northern Arabian Sea. Temporary attachment to naval elements. He closed the file. That's an interesting pattern for someone whose evaluations sound like office work. Ronan felt the assumptions settle over the room without anyone saying them out loud. Favoritism. Protection. Someone important pulling strings. In institutions like this, silence in a file often meant noise somewhere else. He didn't correct them. He focused on his breathing. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. Slow enough to keep the pulse down. Quiet enough that no one could hear it. Explain your assignments, Rusk said, leaning forward now. Because from where we're sitting, they don't add up. I'm not authorized to discuss operational details, Ronan said evenly. Rusk nodded, almost pleased. Of course you aren't. He looked around the table, sharing the moment. That phrase shows up a lot in here. A few smiles appeared. Not mocking. Dismissive. Rusk stood and took a slow step closer, stopping just short of the table. Here's the problem, Staff Sergeant. Joint operations require accountability, transparency. He paused. Unless there was nothing to account for. The word necessary wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. Ronan didn't move. His hands stayed flat against the steel. Years earlier, a senior instructor had told him the hardest part of service wasn't the miles or the mud. It was learning how to stand still while someone else rewrote your name into a story you didn't recognize. That lesson lived in him now. I followed orders, Ronan said. Rusk smiled. Still not an answer. The questions continued, careful and narrowing. Units Ronan couldn't name. Time frames he was ordered to treat as blank space. Roles described in language so polite it erased meaning. Each time Ronan answered briefly. Precisely. Within the narrow lane he was allowed. Each time Rusk reframed it. He avoids specifics, he won't clarify, he doesn't explain. By the time Rusk paused, the room had shifted. People leaned forward now. Pens slowed. Attention sharpened. One man hadn't spoken at all. Rear Admiral Soren Vell sat rigid, hands folded, eyes forward. But Ronan noticed the subtle change, the tightening near the Admiral's jaw when certain phrases surfaced. Recognition, not curiosity. Rusk didn't notice, or didn't care. Silence can mean discipline, Rusk said calmly. Loyalty. A brief pause. Or it can mean there's nothing there. The cameras continued to blink. Ronan stared at the table, grounding himself in the cold certainty of steel. He knew where this was heading. The questions were narrowing. The room was preparing to force something out of him, and soon someone would ask a question that couldn't be answered halfway. As Rusk prepared his next line of questioning, Rear Admiral Vell's eyes fixed on a single redacted entry in the file, one that never should have been mentioned in an open room. The hearing resumed without ceremony. Chairs scraped softly as officers settled back into place. Pens were uncapped. Folders opened. The cameras in the corners continued their steady blinking, indifferent to tension. Brigadier General Corwin Rusk did not sit right away. He stood at the head of the table, file in hand, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind everyone who controlled the pace. "Let's move past impressions," he said. "Let's talk specifics." Ronan Cross kept his eyes forward. The room felt tighter now, as if the walls had leaned in during the break. Rusk flipped a page. "Your evaluations," he said, reading aloud, "are consistent, competent, reliable, calm under pressure." He glanced up. "No negatives, no praise worth framing." A Navy legal officer nodded, already writing. "In my experience," Rusk continued, "language like this usually means one of two things. Either a Marine never did anything worth documenting, or someone made sure nothing detailed ever survived the paperwork." He closed the folder softly. "Which do you think applies to you, Staff Sergeant?" Ronan's breathing remained slow. "I followed orders." Rusk smiled as if he'd just been handed confirmation. "There it is again." This time no one laughed. The room was past that. "Orders don't erase responsibility," Rusk said, "especially when those orders land you in unusual places." He opened the file again. "You weren't embedded with infantry. You weren't assigned as a specialist. And yet you appear repeatedly alongside naval task elements." He looked up. "Care to explain why?" "I'm not authorized to discuss mission roles," Ronan said. Rusk nodded. "Of course you aren't." He stepped closer to the table, voice lowering. "But you understand how that sounds. Joint operations rely on clarity, trust, accountability." He paused. "Unless there was no role to clarify." A Marine colonel crossed his arms. A Navy captain leaned back slightly, reassessing. Ronan felt the pressure building, not as fear, but as restraint pressing against its limits. He had been trained for environments like this, where the threat was not violence but erosion. "I carried out assigned duties," he said. "That's not an answer," Rusk replied. "That's a dodge." The question sharpened. Rusk asked about command relationships Ronan could not name, about timelines he had been ordered to treat as blank space, about deployments that began and ended without explanation. Each time Ronan answered carefully. Minimal words, no extra detail. Each time Rusk reframed it. He doesn't remember, he can't explain, he refuses to cooperate. By the time Rusk paused again, the tone of the room had shifted from skepticism to something colder. Not anger, assessment. A recess was called. Outside the chamber, the hallway filled with low voices, conversations overlapped, sharp and speculative. "Doesn't add up, looks protected. Why bring him here if everything's classified?" Ronan sat alone on a bench near the wall. His posture remained straight, but the stillness cost more now. His fingers curled once against his palm, then relaxed. He didn't drink the water someone had left beside him. Open hostility would have been easier. At least hostility admits you matter. This was dismissal. Clean and efficient, like a document stamped and filed away. When they returned to the room, Rusk did not waste time. "Let's address the obvious," he said. "Your attachment to a naval task element during your last deployment." The air changed. Even Ronan felt it. "According to this," Rusk continued, tapping the file, "you were present during multiple maritime interdiction operations." He looked up. "That places you in proximity to lethal force." Ronan said nothing. Rusk's smile thinned. "In environments like that, everyone contributes. Everyone carries weight." He leaned in. "So what was yours?" "You're asking me to discuss classified material," Ronan replied evenly. "I'm asking you to account for yourself," Rusk said. "There's a difference." He straightened, voice carrying now. "Silence can mean discipline, loyalty." A brief pause. "Or it can mean there's nothing there." The room went still. Ronan understood what Rusk was doing. Force him to speak or define him as empty. "Yes, sir," Ronan said when asked if he understood how this appeared. "And you're still choosing not to clarify?" Yes, sir. Pen scratched. The record thickened. Ronan stared at the tabletop, grounding himself in the cold certainty of steel. He had known from the moment he sat down that this would narrow, that eventually the questions would stop circling and strike directly. Across the table, Rear Admiral Soren Vell shifted slightly in his chair, just enough to be noticed by those trained to read posture. His eyes moved to the file in Rusk's hand, lingering on a single redacted line. Rusk did not see it. He was already preparing the next question, confident that the pressure was finally doing its work. As Rusk leaned forward again, unaware of the line he was about to cross, Rear Admiral Vell's jaw set like a man recognizing a boundary being tested in the wrong room. Something shifted before anyone spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't announced. It was the kind of change felt only by people who had spent time around danger that didn't announce itself. A pause held too long. A breath taken a fraction late. Rear Admiral Soren Vell had remained silent since the hearing began, posture rigid, hands folded as if fixed in place. But as Brigadier General Corwin Rusk continued, Vell's stillness altered. His eyes lifted, not toward Ronan Cross, but toward the file in Rusk's hand. Rusk didn't notice, or chose not to. "You were present during multiple interdiction windows," Rusk said, scanning the page. "That's the wording, present, not assigned, not embedded." A Navy legal officer murmured something under their breath. Another officer leaned in to read. Ronan said nothing. Vell's jaw tightened, then released. Controlled, precise. The look of someone recognizing a boundary being tested by someone who didn't know it existed. Rusk continued. "At minimum, you were combat adjacent." The word landed differently now. The questions narrowed. Timelines. Command relationships. Why a Marine Staff Sergeant would appear alongside naval elements without a publicly listed task. Rusk smiled while he asked, but the smile had thinned. Ronan's calm, once dismissed as passivity, began to feel wrong to the room. Men with nothing to hide cracked under pressure. They over-explained. They defended. They reached for emotion. Ronan did none of that. His posture remained exact. Shoulders square, chin level, breathing slow. When he answered, his words were brief. When he didn't, he offered no apology. That kind of control unsettled people. At one point, Rusk referenced a training pipeline that did not exist in any unclassified system. It was meant to sound impressive, vague enough to pass. Vell's head turned an inch. The Navy captain beside him noticed and froze. A legal officer frowned, then quietly closed a folder as if unsure it should be open at all. The room shifted again. Not fear, confusion. People began to sense that Ronan's silence wasn't avoidance. It was containment. A junior staff member whispered something about night insertion protocols. The Marine colonel stiffened. His eyes flicked toward Vell, then away. Ronan felt the attention move. No longer fixed on what he wasn't saying, but on why he couldn't. Rusk paused mid-sentence as if expecting interruption. None came. The pause stretched, uncomfortable now. Rusk cleared his throat and pressed on, but the rhythm was gone. Vell adjusted his posture, sitting straighter, hands separating to rest on the arms of his chair. It was a stance more suited to command than observation. A junior officer near the back glanced toward the door, then back to the table. The unspoken question formed in the room. What if Ronan Cross wasn't refusing to speak because he had nothing to say? What if he was refusing because saying it would change who had the right to ask? Rusk felt the loss of control even if he didn't understand it. His humor sharpened. His questions narrowed. His patience thinned. He leaned closer, voice quieter, harder. "You understand how this looks, Staff Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "And you're comfortable letting the record reflect this level of non-cooperation?" "Yes, sir." The certainty in the answer stalled a few pens. Rusk glanced up at the cameras mounted high in the corners. The red lights blinked steadily. He straightened his jacket, ensuring they were active. "Very well," he said. "Let's make this clear." The room settled into a new stillness, not bored, not amused, watchful. Rusk stepped to the table and placed his hands on its edge, leaning forward just enough to dominate the space without touching it. "I asked you earlier about your deployments," he said. "You chose not to answer." He held Ronan's gaze. "I'll ask again." Plainly, Ronan felt the weight settle into his chest, heavy, familiar. The kind of pressure that narrowed the world to a single decision. During your last joint deployment, Rusk said, voice sharp now, how many enemy combatants did you personally neutralize? The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Ronan closed his eyes for the briefest moment, not to hide, to measure. He took one controlled breath in through his nose, held it, then let it out slowly. Then he lifted his head and met Rusk's eyes. Chairs creaked softly as people leaned forward. A pen slipped from someone's fingers and struck the floor. Vel's spine went rigid. Ronan's expression did not change. No pride, no anger, no hesitation. 73, he said. The word landed like weight dropped into still water. No reaction followed. No gasp, no laughter. Just silence. Ronan did not elaborate. He did not explain when or where or why. He gave the number as if confirming a count on a checklist. Rusk blinked once. Several people stared at Ronan as if they hadn't heard correctly. Someone near the back whispered the word again, quietly, like repeating it might make it smaller. Rusk straightened slowly. That's a serious claim, he said. You're telling this panel you personally accounted for 73 enemy casualties? Yes, sir, Ronan replied. No emphasis, no apology. A murmur moved through the room, uneven and uncontrolled, not laughter this time. Disbelief. Over what period? Rusk asked. What operation? I am not authorized to discuss operational details, Ronan said. The silence that followed felt different. Charged. Rusk exhaled sharply. You expect us to accept that number without context? I expect you to record my answer, Ronan said. That was all. Rear Admiral Vel's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. The cameras continued to hum, capturing a moment that had just drifted beyond their clearance. The balance in the room shifted. Not completely, but enough to be felt. Rusk had wanted embarrassment. Collapse. What he had received instead was a number that refused to explain itself. As the weight of that single word settled over the table, Rear Admiral Vel began to rise. Slowly, deliberately, like a man who had decided the room had already gone too far. Rear Admiral Soren Vel did not speak right away. He rose from his chair slowly, the scrape of metal against tile cutting through the silence more sharply than any raised voice could have. Every head in the room turned before he said a word. Authority shifted instinctively, the way it always does when someone who truly owns a situation decides it has gone far enough. Cut the recording, Vel said. The command wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A technician hesitated, eyes flicking toward Brigadier General Corwin Rusk. Vel did not look at the technician. I said cut it now. The red lights on the cameras blinked once, then went dark. The faint mechanical hum faded, leaving the room exposed as if a curtain had been pulled away. Rusk straightened, surprise flashing across his face. Admiral, with respect. Vel raised one hand. The interruption never finished forming. This hearing has moved beyond your authority, Vel said evenly. His gaze swept the table, not counting rank but clearance. And it should never have been conducted in an open forum. A ripple passed through the room, not sound. Understanding, Vel continued. Anyone present who does not hold Joint Special Access authorization will exit immediately. No one moved at first. Vel's eyes hardened. That was not a suggestion. Chairs began to slide back. Confused officers stood gathering papers with uncertain hands. A legal aide whispered a protest, then stopped when no one supported it. Within moments, more than half the room had cleared, the heavy door closing behind them with a final echoing thud. Only a small group remained. Rusk's jaw tightened. Admiral, if such an operation exists, you were not read into it, General, Vel cut in calmly. And you were not meant to be. The words landed cleanly, final. Vel turned slightly, angling his body toward Ronan Cross for the first time since the hearing began. His expression did not soften into sympathy. It shifted into recognition. Staff Sergeant, Vel said, you were correct to maintain silence. Ronan remained still, hands flat on the table, eyes forward. Vel addressed the remaining officers. The operation referenced here exists. Its designation, scope, and outcomes remain classified beyond standard reporting systems. Rusk stiffened. Staff Sergeant Cross served under Joint Command Authority, Vel continued. His assignment was lawful. His actions were authorized. His record appears incomplete because it was designed to be. No one spoke. Vel paused, letting the words settle into the room like weight. He answered your question accurately, Vel said, and he did so with restraint. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't skeptical. It was recalibrating. Rusk opened his mouth, then closed it. The confidence that had carried him through the hearing drained from his posture, leaving something brittle behind. Vel turned back to Ronan. You are dismissed from this hearing pending reassignment under my office. Ronan stood smoothly. No rush, no hesitation. He raised his hand in a clean salute, controlled and exact, then turned toward the exit. As he moved, something unexpected happened. One officer stood, then another, not because protocol demanded it, not because rank ordered it. They stood because understanding had replaced assumption, because judgment had been replaced by respect. The room remained silent as Ronan walked toward the door. His boots struck the floor in measured rhythm. He did not look at anyone as he passed. He did not slow. Behind him, Rusk remained seated. His hands rested on the table where he had leaned so comfortably before. His eyes followed Ronan, but they did not meet his. Vel watched Ronan leave, then turned back to the table. This hearing is terminated effective immediately, he said. All pending concerns regarding Staff Sergeant Cross are dismissed in full due to classified operational constraints. No one objected. No one even shifted. This decision is final, Vel added. No appeal, no amendment, no further review. The words changed the room without ceremony. Rusk stood slowly as if waiting for a follow-up that never came. His expression flattened. Vel did not look at him. Staff Sergeant Cross will be reassigned under my direct authority, Vel said. Any attempt to reopen this matter without my written authorization will be treated as a violation of command protocol. The remaining officers understood what had just happened. This wasn't a favor. It was a correction. The door opened again. Ronan Cross stepped back into the room briefly to receive final instruction. He stood at attention, posture unchanged from the moment he had first entered. Your reassignment is effective immediately, Vel said. Yes, sir, Ronan replied. That was all. Chairs slid back again. The officers rose as one, no signal, no command. They stood because it felt wrong to remain seated. Ronan raised his hand once more in a precise salute. Vel returned it without hesitation. Ronan turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. Only then did the room breathe again. 2 days later, Ronan Cross would step into a very different room. One without cameras, without mockery, and without anyone mistaking silence for absence. 2 days later, Ronan Cross stood in a room that felt nothing like the last one. The space was wide and bright, built for work rather than judgment. No cameras blinked from the corners. No raised table divided authority from presence. A digital map glowed softly across one wall, layered with maritime routes and coastal markers that shifted as data updated. Rear Admiral Soren Vel entered without ceremony. This is Staff Sergeant Cross, he said simply. No embellishment, no numbers. He's here because his perspective matters. No one smiled. No one scoffed. They nodded. Ronan took his seat at the long table, posture relaxed but alert. The officers around him were senior but different from the panel he'd faced before. Their attention wasn't predatory. It was focused. The questions that followed were sharp but clean. They asked about pattern recognition, about timing windows, about behavioral markers that appeared before escalation. Not what happened, but how danger announced itself when you knew how to read it. Ronan answered carefully. He chose his words with the same discipline he'd shown in the hearing, but the silence between his sentences was different now. It wasn't hostile. It was attentive. He pointed to a cluster on the map and explained why it mattered. Not where he'd been, not what he'd done, but what repeated itself when people thought no one was watching. He spoke in probabilities, not stories, tendencies, not triumphs. A Navy commander challenged him once politely. Field experience doesn't always translate to strategic forecasting. Ronan paused, then nodded. Only if you bring ego with you. No one laughed. They listened. As the discussion deepened, the room leaned toward him, not physically but in focus. They asked follow-up questions, clarifications, adjustments. The map shifted as his observations reshaped it. When the meeting ended, there was no applause. A few officers gathered their notes. One held the door open. Another thanked him for his time like it was the most natural thing in the world. Respect. Stripped of ceremony. Outside the conference room, the hallway felt brighter, though the lights were the same. Ronan adjusted the strap on his uniform as he walked, a small habit done without thought. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt lighter. Not because the weight was gone, but because it had finally been placed where it belonged. Rear Admiral Vell caught up to him near the end of the corridor. "You handled yourself correctly," he said. "Yes, sir." Vell studied him for a moment. "The system isn't built for men like you. It prefers noise, records, things it can display." Ronan said nothing. "That doesn't mean it doesn't need you," Vell continued. "It just means it rarely knows how to recognize you." They parted without another word. Ronan stepped outside into open air. The city beyond the building moved as it always had. Traffic flowing, people passing. Unaware of the quiet recalibration that had taken place inside, he blended into it easily. Some service was meant to be witnessed. Some was meant to disappear. Ronan understood now that he would never have a story to tell, not one that could be shared openly. His record would remain thin by design. His work would continue in rooms like the one he'd just left. Rooms that listened rather than judged. And that was fine, because the measure of what he carried had never depended on applause. It depended on restraint. The system would move on. It always did. Files would be closed. Names would be replaced. But the correction that had taken place would linger quietly, shaping decisions long after the hearing was forgotten. Ronan Cross did not linger. He walked on with the same measured pace he had carried into the first room, past doors that now felt smaller than they once had. The weight he bore remained, but it no longer pressed against him alone. For the first time since the hearing, silence felt like alignment rather than defense. What no one in that room knew yet was that Ronan's quiet influence would surface one last time, briefly, decisively, before his work returned to the shadows for good. Ronan Cross did not hear about the hearing again. No follow-up memo circulated. No quiet apology arrived in his inbox. The system closed the file the way it always did, efficiently, without commentary. For most people, that would have felt incomplete. For Ronan, it felt correct. His reassignment took him away from public corridors and into rooms that rarely appeared on organizational charts. The work was deliberate and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Briefings without names, maps without labels, decisions shaped by patterns rather than stories. He was not asked to recount what he had done. He was asked what he saw coming. Weeks later, a maritime operation unfolded far from the room where his silence had once been questioned. It ended quickly, quietly. Most people never heard about it at all. Those who did saw only a footnote, a situation resolved before it became something else. No one connected it to Ronan Cross. That was the point. Rear Admiral Soren Vell read the after-action summary alone in his office long after sunset. He paused at a paragraph that referenced an early adjustment in positioning, one small decision that had altered the entire outcome. He closed the file without comment. Somewhere else, Brigadier General Corwin Rusk stood in a different room addressing a different panel. His confidence was intact, his voice steady, but something had changed. He avoided certain lines of questioning now, certain assumptions. He had learned where authority stopped. Ronan never saw him again. Months passed, then more. Ronan's record remained thin. Promotions came slowly when they came at all. Commendations arrived stripped of detail, written in language that said nothing and meant everything. He did not mind. In quiet moments, he sometimes thought back to the steel table, the cameras, the question that had forced him to choose between obedience and truth. He did not regret his answer. He regretted only that the room had needed it. The military, like any institution, remembered what it could record. It rewarded what could be displayed. But there were always people like Ronan, men whose value appeared only in absence, only in what did not happen because they were there. They did not seek recognition. They accepted responsibility. One evening, long after the hearing had faded into paperwork and memory, Ronan stood alone on a balcony overlooking a dark stretch of water. The wind moved across the surface in quiet lines, repeating patterns. No one else noticed. He watched them for a long moment. Then he turned back inside. There was work to do, the kind that would never carry his name, the kind that would never be joked about in a room built for judgment. And that was how it would remain, because some service is meant to be witnessed and some is meant to disappear. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.